Hello everybody, very warm welcome to this session this morning, or should I say this afternoon, on employee screening. I'm very pleased to welcome you all, and also my colleague James Waby, who is a pre-employment screening specialist. So hopefully what James doesn't know isn't worth knowing. So I'm going to pick his brains later on, and hopefully he'll give you the benefit of his knowledge. So kicking straight off, we're obviously here to talk about screening and in particular your AML requirements and obligations, but also your other obligations as well, because there are quite a few of them. So we'll go through those. So moving straight on to administration, normal rules really apply for those of you who normally come along to my webinars. Questions, if you want to lodge those on the system, then James and I will pick those up later on. For the solicitors amongst you, obviously it's A2 in terms of competency. Recordings will be available after the event, and we will be getting in contact with everybody just to make sure that we answer any questions that they may have, and also to let them have recordings. I'm going to run a couple of polls as well towards the end. Just want to try and get a feel for where people are with screening at the moment, and also in relation to references. And you'll see where I'm coming from in terms of references as we go through, because certainly a lot of people have issues with those. So just by way of an introduction, we're going to be looking at, as I say, employee screening, going to look at regulatory obligations, and accreditation requirements, and as I say, mainly in relation to anti-money laundering, because obviously we've got the new legal sector affinity group, or the LSAG group guidance come through, and we've obviously got the money laundering regulations themselves as well. We're also going to look at the consequences of failing to screen people properly, and as I say, that isn't just in relation to money laundering but other aspects as well, and you'll see that as we go through. We're then going to look at some employee screening best practice and also some screening methods, and that's pretty much where James is going to be coming in to give you his thoughts. So I suppose the main thing with all of this is making sure that we hire the right people, and if we don't hire the right people, then it can have all sorts of issues. As many of you who come to my webinars will know, I tend to sort of use that phrase, your people can be your biggest asset, but at the end of the day, they can be your biggest risk as well. Certainly if you don't get your hiring right and your ongoing screening of staff right, then you could have some significant problems if you're not careful. So as I say, we'll have a look at all the things that we should be doing and perhaps not doing, or certainly making sure we don't do going forward. So just in terms of the regulatory side of things, they're not specific. There's nothing really specific about screening in the codes of conduct and the principles. But what I have done is I've sort of put my thoughts on, which ones will apply. And you can obviously make it up for yourself as to whether, in fact, you would take the same view. So my view on the core principles, acting in a way that upholds the public trust and confidence. Well, of course, if you allow people into your business who are not the right people, who then potentially can be committing internal fraud or being negligent or whatever it might be because they're not experienced and qualified as perhaps they should be, then quite clearly, the SRA is likely to have a look at that one. We've then got acting with integrity. Some of you may think, well, why does that one sort of come in? Well, if you willfully or recklessly disregard the rules, it will be regarded by the SRA as you lacking integrity. So that's pretty much why that one comes in. Moving across to the code of conduct itself, you'll see why that one comes in there. So we've got 2.1a, and this is the code of conduct for firms rather than individuals, because of, clearly it's the managers, it's the Colts and other managers within the business that are in charge of all of this. So 2.1a, you comply with the SRA's regulatory arrangements, as well as with other regulatory and legislative requirements. So of course, we talk about money laundering, but I would also bring to your attention the Companies Act in relation to how company directors, managers and such like should be running their businesses. And of course, making sure the right people come into the business is one of those things as well. So if you don't do that, then, you know, are you risking breaches of the Companies Act? We've then got 2.2 of the Code of Conduct. You keep and maintain records to demonstrate compliance with your obligations under the SRA's regulatory arrangements. So of course, we need to make sure that we keep records of interviews and the screening or the vetting that we've done with people, copy of references. Even if you send out a reference request but you don't get anything back, the mere fact that you have actually requested it shows that you're doing all you can. And again, I'll come back to the issues that we have around references later on, because it's not that easy to deal with those. We've then got 2.5. You identify, monitor and manage all material risks to your business. As I said before, you know, we do see our employees as our biggest assets, but they can be our biggest risk. So I would suggest that it falls well within that one in terms of material risks to your business. Corps must take reasonable steps. This is 9.1 to ensure compliance by their firm and its managers and employees with the SRA's regulatory arrangements. And so, you know, the COLP very much needs to ensure that they're doing all the right things, getting all the right people in place and such like. And I said this at the AML update webinar that we did very recently, and that is that the COLP needs to very much embed themselves into what the MLRO, the Money Laundering Reporting Officer, and where appropriate, the Money Laundering Compliance Officer, you know, the things that they're doing as well, because although, yes, you've got the MLRO, you may have the MLCO, the COLP ultimately takes responsibility for all compliance within the practice. So they need to have an oversight of that as well, which is why a lot of COLPs are actually being put as the independent oversight of money laundering. So as long as they're not the MLRO and the MLCO as well, then they could be seen as the oversight there. Just a quick one, the SRA, it does actually undertake, now I sort of use the SRA to cover the Law Society as well, but certainly when solicitors qualify and they're going through the various processes, they are subject to standard DBS checks. So these are the disclosure and barring service checks. So you might want to take that into account when you're actually looking at your screening. But as I say, we'll go through some bits and pieces later on just so that you can see what screening resources are available to you. For those of you who are Lexel and CQS, so the Conveyancing Quality Scheme, if you have those, then you need to comply with specific things there. So Lexel 4.5, practices must have procedures to deal effectively with recruitment and progression, which must include references and ID checking, and where appropriate, the checking of disciplinary records. Well, of course, we've now got the SRA's digital register, so there really is no excuse for people to not look on there and see what's going on. In terms of ID checking, well, we're ID checking our clients. So, you know, why not do an online check of employees as well at the same time? You know, because if those checks don't get it right, then we've all got problems, haven't we? So why not use it for ID checking of employees as well? And references, as I say, we'll come back to. In terms of CQS, they tend to fall under the same core practice management standards as Lexel. So, you know, referencing and ID checking is all there as well. But of course, for those firms that are CQS, you will know the hoops you had to jump through. And certainly I remember them when I was in practice, where we had to get lots and lots of staff approved, and they had to go through the DBS checking system and things like that. So again, you know, you may want to consider that as part of your screening. And obviously, you know, you need to have screening policies, and so you can put that in there as well. So coming on to the big one, which really is the main cause for concern for firms at the moment, and that's in relation to their money laundering obligations. And of course, that's come to the fore really recently because of the publication of the legal sector affinity group guidance, and so there's a lot of stuff in there that has given a lot of clarity. I mean, it's a big document. It's over 200 pages, but there's a lot of clarity now in there in terms of what is required, rather than leaving it open to interpretation. There's still obviously some interpretation there. One of the issues there is in terms of assessing whether your firm is of a size and nature that triggers the various requirements. And as I said before, you know, when we did our AML update very recently, and we were talking about the MLCO and we were talking about the independent audit, and you know, it's sort of depending on the size and sort of makeup of the firm. The SRA really hasn't given us the clarification that we need in terms of, well, who fits into the exemption criteria. And so best practice, and best practice has come from people at the SRA as well, is that actually you work on the basis that you're not exempt, because you're going to have a real uphill struggle to convince the SRA that you are, you know, exempt from these requirements. And for all intents and purposes, it's good practice anyway. So why not do this across the piece and make sure that you are covered? So we'll see here, regulations state where appropriate in regards to the size and nature of the business. So again, I think, yes, you know, everybody should do it, but how deep you do this is obviously then subject to your thoughts and such like. But again, what you don't want to do is be in a position where you're having to justify to the regulator why you haven't done something. If it's not too much trouble and cost, then, you know, why not just do it and make sure that you're not going to get questioned on it. So we've got before appointment is made. Well, you know, you should be doing that anyway. And obviously during the course of employment, and we'll have a look at some of that in a moment. You've got to screen the employee's skills, knowledge, conduct, and integrity. So of course, what would normally help us with that? Well, it's CVs, but of course, make sure that the CVs do in fact tell the true story. You know, how many cases have we seen in the past where people have manipulated and enhanced their CV to get a job, and then all of a sudden they get caught out? And you know, I've seen some cases where it's sort of taken 10, 15 years for people to get caught out. So, you know, make sure you do the checks right at the very beginning. Screening could mean having regard to a person's qualifications. Well, again, you know, we have seen forged qualifications. So, you know, yes, by all means, get copies of the certificates, but don't take them on face value. Make sure that if there's any reason for concern, then ring up the university, ring up the LPC, the PSC providers, whatever, and ask them about this particular individual. Make sure that actually what they're presenting to you does belong to them and they have got the qualifications that are there, or that they say they have. Have a look at regulatory, professional, ethical obligations to which the person is subject. So again, you know, we tend to sort of focus on the solicitors in the practice because we've got the specific code of conduct for solicitors, but of course there's other people within the practice as well. And it's a drum I keep on banging with the regulators, and that is, look, you know, there's a lot of people, probably more non-solicitors working in legal practices than others, you know, than solicitors. And so we need to focus on them as well. So, you know, make sure that you're looking at them as well in as much detail as is required. Checking a person's references, I'm going to sort of leave that one there because I'm going to come on to that specifically in a moment. We've got the screening and amount of verification provided should be proportionate to the individual's role in the business and level of independent authority and decision making involved in the role. So for example, if you were taking on and this is no disrespect to office juniors, but you know, if you were taking on an office junior, an administrator, for example, then you may not need to give them the same level of screening as you would do a new partner, somebody moving into the accounts department, where of course there are high risks there in relation to internal fraud. So assess it. But of course, you know, going back to the rules that we were going through a moment ago, the SRA is expecting you to keep records of why you have determined certain things. So yes, by all means, have policies in place. Make sure that you define the levels of screening that you're going to do for the likes of office juniors, as opposed to solicitors, accounts people, and such like. It's really got to be there. So just running through a few of the checks, we talked about on appointment, skills, knowledge, expertise. So we're talking about qualification checks. We're talking about test of knowledge as well. So it may be that actually you want to put people through test cases as part of the interview process. Validating practicing statuses as well. So of course, and again, this goes back to non-solicitors as well, because they can be struck off just as much as anybody else through a Section 43 order. So best thing to do, go straight to the SRA's digital register and see if there's any issues that have come up with that individual there. So, you know, you've got the tools there, so why not use them? One little rider that I would give you is that under certain circumstances, and I have to say they are very limited, but under certain circumstances, people may request to the SRA that they not appear on various registers. Same applies with the Law Society. So just because somebody doesn't appear on a register doesn't mean that they're not who they say they are. All you need to do, pick up the phone and ask the question of the SRA. I've done it quite a few times, and you certainly get the answers that you need. So yeah, a quick call is very much worth it. Conduct and integrity, well, that's taking up your references, that's doing your CRB checks, but of course, make sure that you get the right level of DBS check. You've obviously got your standard, and then you've got enhanced as well. So people, as I say, who are in higher risk categories, so the likes of your accounts clerks, you may want to put them through an enhanced check rather than a standard. But again, that's up to you. But again, for our accounts people, you may want to do financial credit checks, because again, you know, they are going to be in the midst of all the money. And I'm not for one moment suggesting that we've got dodgy people in the accounts department, but you know, I've seen too many cases of people being tempted because they've got financial difficulties or they've got caught up in online scams, and you know, it could be easier for them to sort of dip into the client account than it can for other people. And I mentioned disciplinary histories as well. One which really does need to be used these days, and it's free, so why wouldn't you use it? And that's to do a check on social media and other media outlets as well. So, you know, put somebody's name in, it's going to come up with their Twitter, their Facebook, their LinkedIn, whatever it might be. And of course, if they've been in the press because of stealing or whatever it might be, forging documents, then they're likely to come up on those particular checks. So, you know, again, you've got these free tools, why not use them? And I talked about e-verification as well. So if we're putting our clients through online e-verification, why not do it for staff as well? During employment, so what would we be looking at during employment? Well, competency declarations. So are we actually happy that somebody is as competent as they're supposed to be? They've done the training courses and things like that. And actually they have undertaken the courses that they were putting down that they were going to do. I mean, that's all part of your competency checks anyway, but you know, for this purpose, I think it's there. Appraisals, so if you're doing annual appraisals, why not use those as well? One-to-ones, so people are doing far more regular one-to-ones these days. Again, you know, that might alert us to any difficulties or things that are going on. We also need to have a look at AML training. So have we provided training to people at the intervals and at the standard that they require for their roles? We've then got conduct and integrity. So we've talked about search engines. We've talked about disciplinary histories and electronic identification. So you can clearly see from there that actually we can cut off or we can tick off a lot of those boxes just by doing some of those very brief checks. Talked about references, what you can and can't. I'm just going to show my screen because I think my screen may have gone.
I was just about to say, I think the slides have just dropped off. That's it, yeah.
Okay, it's come back. So what can you and what can't you say in a reference? So an employer does not have to provide a reference. I've been having a little bit of debate with the government and also the SRA on this one, because the government does in fact say that yes, it's not mandatory for employers to provide references unless they're in a regulated industry. Well, of course, the solicitor's profession is regulated. And so I pose the question, well, if it's regulated, then shouldn't solicitors be providing references and requesting them as well? You'll be pleased to hear that although the government gives an indication as being the finance industry, the SRA has basically said that law firms do not have to provide references. There's no rules to say they do. But you should certainly be providing references where you can, as long as they are fair, accurate, and not misleading. You can have various references. You can have your short references, which is your basic details, so name, salary details, position, things like that. But also you can have your more detailed references, which goes into the person's performance and such like. So make sure that you are asking for the right thing. Now, as I said right at the very beginning, you can ask, but you won't necessarily get, because a lot of people are so frightened of the risks that come with references that they don't want to provide them. Well, what are those risks? Well, of course, if you're not fair and you're not accurate and you are misleading, then yes, an employee could come for you and obviously take you to the relevant tribunals for providing wrong references and such like. But as long as you're not that, so you're not misleading and you are fair and you're accurate, then what is the problem? At the end of the day, we now all have these screening obligations, and therefore we should all be sort of scratching each other's backs and making sure that the people we're bringing in are the right people. So if we ask for references, we would like to think that we're going to get them, and vice versa. If somebody asks us, then hopefully they'll be expecting us to give them as well. Be very careful about asking for certain things. So when you're talking about absences, for example, make sure you don't fall foul of the discrimination side of things, because of course that's a protected characteristic, and absence may be linked to health issues and other things like that, which could be used against you. So be careful there. So just covering off a couple of the issues, what does a detailed reference normally cover? Well, it's skills, ability, details about character, disciplinary details. Again, you've got to be careful with disciplinary details. There are some people who will actually provide references on a good reference on the basis that if somebody leaves quietly because they've been found to do something but the firm doesn't want to go through disciplinary procedures, then that could be held against them. The other thing that you've got to consider as well is that if you provide a reference for somebody who you're not happy with and they sort of leave, then I suspect it's going to be a fairly serious issue. And if you're allowing it to be swept under the carpet like that, then you could fall foul of the SRA's reporting requirements. And certainly the SRA will have something to say if you are sort of giving people get out of jail free cards, so as long as they basically walk out the door. So be really, really careful about what you're doing there. If someone's performance record shows they need to improve in a few areas, the reference should not say they excelled at the job. So again, this is making sure that it's accurate. So be really, really careful what you're doing there. But as long as you get it right, again, what are the risks? So let's have due consideration on that one.
Brian, I think oh yeah, next slide. So I think we're just one slide behind then.
Okay, so hopefully, James, you're looking at references. Are they worth the paper they're written on?
We're on now, yeah.
Yep, excellent. Okay, so we raised, are they real earlier on? Again, make sure that they are in fact real. I'll show you a case in a moment where somebody had actually manipulated circumstances to mislead their employer. Do they just provide factual information? Well, again, are they worth the paper they're written on? Well, a lot of references these days aren't. Yes, you can tick a box to say, well, I've requested one, and if you're lucky, you've got one, but it doesn't really serve any purpose, which is really why we need to pick up the phone if we've got any concerns and say, look, can I have an off-the-record discussion with you? And you go from there. I have come across situations personally where I've had to deal with partners who haven't been doing the right things. They've been put on various warnings, and before they've then obviously been kicked out the door, they've left themselves. They've gone to another firm. I've then been expecting a request for a reference, which never turns up, to then be able to say, well, look, you know, you've got a real problem coming your way. You need to watch this. Suffice to say that what some of those people do is they get caught out sooner or later. And there was one where they went to the next firm, and then sure enough, after about 12 months, they got caught out there. You know, they were then left to sort of go and leave a mess in somebody else's backyard. But what they then did was they became a locum because they couldn't get jobs in permanent jobs elsewhere. So when you're taking locums on, be very, very careful. And again, this is no disrespect to locums. I'm sure the vast majority of them are the right people, but there are some people in there who are taking advantage of perhaps the weak referencing and screening that goes on there. So just a pointer to watch out for. Do references match the CVs? So make sure that, you know, if you've got dates of employment, do they actually match what's on the CV? We've talked about the risks, and in terms of personal references, certainly it was something going back to my RF recruitment days. You know, we were always warned, you know, who in their right mind would give a personal reference or referee if they knew they were going to get a negative reference from them. So, you know, you need to bear in mind, are people giving you the details of people who are going to give them a very good reference, or is it, you know, they're frightened that somebody else might give them a dodgy one? So, you know, just have a think about that one. Just a quick example, I actually had to withdraw an offer of employment to somebody once because, and this was on the day they actually came into the office to start, because we received the reference back on that particular day. And of course, we'd issue the contract and it was subject to references and all the other bits and pieces. But it was quite a damning reference. And so I tried to phone up the employer to get information there, and they were unwilling to provide it. So I could only go by what was on the reference. And I was very concerned that you know, this person was going into a fairly high risk area. And so I withdrew the offer on the day, and obviously apologized, but said, you know, well, I'm left with no option because of what your employer has said. Now, they said it's a total lie. And I said, well, look, I'm happy to review matters as and when that's been shown to be the case. But as things stand, I can't. They actually went on to take this person to court and they won. Suffice to say that the employee the person never came back to see us. Because it took a long time to sort out, and they obviously sorted themselves out. But you can clearly see that you know, these are some real issues that go on there. And I talked earlier on about some fraud cases. So we had here a person setting up a false law firm email address so they could provide a bogus reference to a real firm looking to employ her. Obviously, once they found out, then obviously she was dismissed. But you can see the lengths that some people go to. And we've then got our trainee solicitor who fabricated certificates, and I mentioned those earlier on. So, you know, quick call to the providers is always a good one. And we've got a barrister there who forged certain qualifications to get into law school. So again, this is real. So, you know, it does happen out there, so be aware of it. Quickly, before I hand over to James for him to have a little bit of a say, what do the professional indemnity and other insurers expect? And when I'm talking about other insurers, I'm talking about your office and business insurers as well, because, you know, they will be on the hook for things where there's potentially fraud and other things like that. So they all have an insight into this and an interest in this. But they all expect you to be carrying out appropriate checks as well. And some will actually be asking for certificates to be given from solicitors, so declarations, for example, and they'll want some of the details that I've provided on there. So have a look at that one. Don't just tick boxes that say, you know, do you seek references? Again, as I've said in numerous webinars in the past when we've talked about PII renewals and things like this, you've got to have a story. and that story has to be, or part of that story has to be, screening staff and making sure that the risk profile of the firm is no higher than it needs to be. So do all the right things for your insurers as well, because even if the regulators don't have anything to say to you, if you're not doing the right things to an appropriate level, your insurers will. And of course, we've seen what the market's like over the last year or so, and they will drop you as quick as they will drop a stone if they believe that you're going to be a high risk to them. So screening checks to consider. I'm going to take a little bit of a breather here, and I'm going to hand over to James to go through these and a couple of other slides as well. James, as we discussed, when you're ready, if you want to let me know when to move on to the next slide, and I'll do that. But over to you, James.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Brian, and thanks for that insight. And just to pick up on a few things that Brian said there, that as an industry, we have regulatory obligations and legislative obligations and obligations to insurers, but we have an obligation to the industry itself and our businesses to protect our businesses and protect our people within those businesses. So it is really important to get these things right for all of those reasons. So there are a number of checks that are out there. If you don't have a current process in place, sometimes it could be somewhat overwhelming as to know when to start. So I think the key for your businesses, and what I do a lot, is work with a number of companies to try and make these efficient vetting processes easy to use, compliant, but fast. The key for you is to just really understand what those checks are. So whether you're doing criminal record checks on your solicitors, whether you're running credit checks on anyone in your business or the accounting teams, is really important across all of the checks you see on screen here, is just to actually understand what the requirements are and what the requirements are for those different jobs within your business as well. So things like social media checks, yes, you could just go onto Google and search someone's name, but through technology like ours or other services, you can do quite in-depth social media checks where it will bring through most up-to-date fraudulent cases, any insights into any terrorism activity that someone's been involved in, and actually avoid anything else that was irrelevant against that person just from a social basis. And also, even there's technology in place now to do full social profiling on somebody online to actually see what sort of content they're putting out there, whether they've ever said anything detrimental in the past about previous businesses, and even score those employees as a risk factor of someone coming into your company. So really looking at these checks and seeing how detailed you could go into some of these things. There's a lot out there. Particularly one other thing to pick up on here, which is very prevalent at the moment, is right to work checks. So the climate we're in is very changeable. So your regulations today and the legislation today could be very different tomorrow or the next day. So right to work's a prime example of that. So over the pandemic period, we've been able to remotely collect and validate ID documents. On the 17th of May, that's going to swap back to where it was before. So there's very changeable elements to how you're going to vet people in your business. So it's quite important for you to really consider not how you do things now, also how you recheck people and actually keep up to speed with that regulation and legislation to keep your business safe. So really important to consider these things. If you could just move to the next slide, please, Brian.
Okay.
So what you can see here, and what I decided to put together, was something to show you what a best practice process might look like for screening within a similar business to yours. So these are the companies that I've worked with who do this very well. So a key part of it we've touched on already is actually just understanding the requirements. So what do you actually need to vet that person against for that particular role, and really understanding that, and then actually clarifying within your business what people are responsible for carrying out those checks. So are they actually aware it's their responsibility to do that? Do they understand the timeline of how long it might check for a DBS check to come back to do these credit checks, and really making sure that there's someone in the business who's responsible for that, and everybody along the chain really knows what their role is. 3 is policy. It's really surprising in so many businesses that there isn't a policy for this. There seems to be policies for everything else. Companies I go to, quite often they don't have a policy for vetting and onboarding their candidates, or rechecking them on a monthly basis, on a bi-weekly basis. However, more frequently you need to recheck your employees, which is becoming more and more prevalent now for the SRA to actually focus on, well, are you rechecking people once they're within your business? So once you've got the requirements and the people involved, have a policy in place and then adapt that policy as you need to moving forward. And key to everything at the moment is actually looking at your technology needs. With a lot of remote working at the moment, people have had to get used to dealing with digital processes a lot more. So it was becoming a lot more prevalent anyway, but the pandemic has just expedited the amount of technology you now need in your process. So people are getting used to interactive with automated referencing portals, with online DBS processes. People are using this technology. So where can you look at in your business to help to automate this screening process? So companies are doing this well, are really considering their technology needs. And out the back of that, how does the reporting work? So how do we monitor this so people in the business understand that someone is compliant, when they're going to be uncompliant, how we then recheck that person? So the reporting part of it is really key to get right. So having those 5 steps in place is a good way to go to start getting a very stable screening and vetting process into your business, if it is something that's quite sort of manual and potentially unstructured at the moment. Just the next slide, please, Brian. So we work with a number of customers to help to add automation into this piece as well. So we touched on technology a moment ago. Many businesses may use this exact process or variations of this, but there are technologies available now to help you to do this. It doesn't have to be an admin heavy and manual process in your company to bog down people who might well be adding more value elsewhere in the business if they weren't doing this and having to repeatedly chase references, which, you know, is very difficult to get them returned. There's technology in place across this whole spectrum, as you can see here, where you can use things like a right to work app, which we have the technology within Access for, where you can validate someone's right to work in 5 simple steps. It walks you through the legislation. Post-Brexit, there might not be training available in your business to know how to vet someone and to understand if they have the right to work. The app just walks you through that face-to-face, collecting documents, doing MRZ code checks on a passport to check if it's been a fraudulent document. So you can add pieces of technology into your process here just to help to expedite this and help to manage it on an ongoing basis. So we have things like compliance portals that you can send out to candidates, start getting consent to check people against your certain requirements, so doing credit checks automatically, doing DBS checks, but then actually having that information internally in one centralized place that you can then report on. And even more importantly, as Brian's already attested to, actually having it there as an audit trail. So if you do get audited at any point, or you need to surface information, it's a very easy process for you to do that in one system. So really consider how you can use technology across this piece. If you just want to go to the next slide, Brian.
Yeah, I think just before I do that, James, just to reiterate the point about making sure that you can evidence these things. When the SRA did its recent AML, one of its recent AML thematic reviews, the lack of evidence was one of the problems that it came up with. So yeah, I would totally reinforce making sure that you have that audit trail and you can justify what you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the key things here, and you'll hear this a lot, particularly if you start to engage with process and technology, is actually trying to give a good candidate experience throughout this, so you can actually get the right information in. So I've got an example here on the screen, and this is a candidate portal from our screening technology that we send out to employees and candidates just to try and work them through a compliance process. So whether it's getting referencing from them, requesting documents, asking them questions, getting them to consent to certain terms, or even going through a DBS or credit check, you can surface that to people now in a very clear and concise candidate experience through using portals like these. So this is very important at the minute, and people are expecting this. In our personal lives now, we do a lot through technology. It's the same in the business world. We need to be able to interact with people simply and easily using technology. That's not to say there doesn't have to be a human element to it, but if there is a process you can automate and make better, particularly around vetting people and automation chasing of references, so through this tool, for example, a candidate can add their references in this portal. The system will then automatically then chase that referee to return that reference. If you can automate some of that process, it then frees up the time of that administrative person within your business to do some of the softer things with your employees and with your candidates to help work them through other things that they need to do within the business. So adding in automation to take up some of the repeatable administrative tasks around this and giving your employees and candidates a high level of experience is something that people sort of expect now, but also it's going to help you to remain compliant as a business and keep this going on an ongoing basis. So rechecking people within your company and remaining compliant. Next slide, please, Brian. So I thought I'd just put a snippet of a few businesses we've dealt with and some of the experiences they've had by adding automation into their screening and vetting processes. So for a lot of companies we go to, it has been a very manual process for collecting referencing, collecting documentation. And in some instances, it was taking them up to 10 weeks to get people onboarded, which in your world is going to be too long. If you can reduce that by 40, 50%, which is what we've seen with some of our customers 2 or 3 months after implementing technology, you're going to be reducing that candidate screening time to 5 weeks. Or maybe a more junior role where it's a slightly faster process, you don't need to do as many checks. Someone might be having a week-long process at the moment, you could have them starting within 2 days. So there's a huge amount of operational efficiency that you can gain by just reviewing your screening processes, understanding what your requirements are for your different roles, understanding what people are involved, what policy you have in place, creating a policy if you haven't got one, getting technology in there, understanding what your technology needs are and adding that into your operational process to help this go better, and then reporting on it and rechecking on people. All of that is very important for you to consider. We're here to help, right? So if you have questions around this, you know, we can help you on that. We've advised many businesses on how to implement this. So you have our details here. We'll have a follow up in terms of what's coming out post the session with the slides and conversations you need to have with us. We'll be happy to talk you through how we've done this with other companies to make vetting a bit easier for you.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, James. Just a quick add on to what you've just said there, and it is a big one, particularly as earlier on I was listening to the Information Commissioner at her conference, and so consent, so data protection and all that sort of stuff, really big issue. Make sure you have the appropriate person's consent to provide references and to give them and everything else. So yeah, make sure that you know that is there.
Yeah.
So just finally, want to just pose a couple of polls, if I may. So the first one is, what screening checks do you currently undertake prior to the appointment of an employee? So I'm going to open that one out. You can tick as many as you like. So let's just see what people think on that one. So I'm going to launch that one. So hopefully that's now coming up. And let's see what people are saying. It's really good that you know there is a wide range of different things that people are checking, all in the high numbers. So you know certainly DBS is up there, references up there. Yeah, it's all being done as it should be. For those of you who perhaps aren't doing some of those, then clearly you might want to consider those. So I'm just going to bring that one to a close and move on to the next one. So the next one is, do you currently undertake ongoing screening for all relevant employees? And relevant employees in terms of the money laundering side of things is pretty much everybody. But obviously in particular your MLRO, your MLCO where appropriate. So let's just see what people's thoughts are on that one. So are you undertaking ongoing screening for all relevant employees? I have to say the figures that are coming through are what I expected. So the vast majority of people either are not doing ongoing screening or are unsure about what their position is in relation to that. 26% are yes, but quite clearly we've got quite a lot of people there who are currently, and I'm not going to, don't mean to frighten you, but you are currently in breach of the money laundering regulations. When the SRA starts sort of looking into this, the last thing you want is to be caught napping on that one. So I think there's some work to be done there. So I'm going to close that one off. And the final poll is, do you receive references that provide useful information about a person's past conduct? So we've obviously talked about the basic references. Well, I never really found those of much use. So let's just see what people's thoughts are on that one. So do you receive references that provide useful information about a person's past conduct? And again, the figures are coming out where I pretty much thought they would. So we've got round about 13% saying yes, and 65% saying no. So we can clearly see there the need for references, or the reference regime to be looked at. And it was the reason why I was asking the various regulators about the provision of references by regulated sectors, because certainly in the finance industry, they have to provide references for controlled positions. So the equivalent of the COLP, the COFA, the MLRO, the MLCO. So, it's very much an issue for the finance industry. And I wonder, when you bear in mind how much money the legal profession handles, why the same sort of situation isn't applied there. So it'll be an interesting one to follow up on. But that brings us to the end of the formal session. If there's any questions, and I know we have got some questions, then by all means do put them on the system, and James and I will do our best to pick them up and answer them. If we don't get time to answer them today, then obviously I'm doing a blog anyway, so watch out for that one on LinkedIn. We'll answer those questions there. If you've got to shoot off, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again in the future. But I am now going to go over to the questions, the first of which has come from Dawn, who says, does it make a difference if the firm has FCA registration? Are we required to provide a reference in those circumstances? Well, as I just said a moment ago, where you are regulated by the FCA and you have controlled positions, so as I say, the equivalent of your senior managers, your COLPs, your COFAs, people like that, then yes, you need to obviously get the references, but you also need to provide them as well. James, I don't know whether you've got any further thoughts on that one.
Yeah, so under FCA, a common set to reference people against the money of our financial service customers will require 5 years worth of referencing with gap history. So nothing over 28, 30 days covered tends to be standard practice for what those types of businesses require. I think that might actually answer the next question as well, which was from Brian, which said if there's a long gap in an employee's work record, is it okay to ask about it? So yeah, absolutely it is, and on many frameworks and regulators will request that. So whether it's 28 days, 30 days tends to be around those numbers in terms of what's normally acceptable for you to then ask for an activity claim as to what that person was doing, or to provide supporting documentation or references accordingly.
Okay, thanks, James. Rhonda has asked, you mentioned about enhanced DBS checks for certain staff. Is this possible? My understanding is that only basic checks are permitted for many employees. Yeah, I agree with you, Rhonda. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, what you need to do is make contact with the DBS people, and obviously explain the situation and see whether in fact you can put through enhanced checks. Again, James, I don't know whether you've had any experiences on that one.
Yeah, so exactly right, Rhonda, to be honest with you. So when it comes to enhanced DBS checks, you're more talking about people who are going to be working with vulnerable children, vulnerable adults, NHS, medical sector. A lot of what you would likely do within your sector would be more based around basic and standard DBS checks. But again, look to the DBS. We can provide that service in an automated fashion through our system, but look to the DBS to understand exactly the type of role and then what your requirement is and what you're allowed to check someone for against that role capacity. But yeah, it is correct that you have to look at what role in terms of then deciding what compliance is necessary to benefit.
I think at the end of the day, James, you know, there will be certain people who work with young children and families within the legal profession, you know, dealing with divorce work and separation and sort of child protection and things like that, where that may be more relevant. So, yeah, I think it's got to be on a needs basis. We've got a question there from Eilish. Do you provide or have a precedent reference questionnaire? Well, we'll pick up things with you after the event on that one, Eilish. So if you leave that one with us. Do you know how we can deal with right to work checks with remote workers? James?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most common questions in screening at the moment. Okay, so I could give a very long answer to this. I've had many discussions industry-wide about this. During the pandemic, we could do everything remotely. And the 17th of May is going to go back to face-to-face documentations, looking at that document, holding it in your hand and seeing the employee. So there's a big push to say, well, the technology's there. We worked in a remote fashion to verify identity during the pandemic. Is that not going to be the way forward in the future? I can see that changing at some point, but yeah, the legislation will swap back from the 17th of May so that you do need to see or hold the passport in your hand to get that done. There are nuances around that if someone is completely remote, but yeah, again, we can pick that up maybe in a bit more detail, but yeah, it's very topical that at the moment.
All right, James, thanks for that. Bridget's asked, please can you expand upon what ongoing screening might entail? Well, I think what we'll do, Bridget, we'll pick that one up offline, and we can obviously go into a little bit more detail. Perhaps you might have specific circumstances that you want us to think about. So, but you're obviously going to, and we've had a number of requests for slides and things like that. So you will get the slides anyway, and obviously, you know, you can have a look at those, and if there's any further questions from there, then you know, we can go from there. But we'll pick that one up with you after the event. Oliver has said majority of references received are standard references, i.e. confirmation of the person worked at the company but no further info. Usual referral to give more info, even if off the record. If this is the case, do we just accept it for what it is? You can only be, you know, you can only go to reasonable steps, and therefore, as long as you have requested, and it might be, you know, regulators obviously expect you to do a little bit of follow-up. So I would go with the rule of 2, as I normally do, and that is you send a reference. If you don't hear anything back within 7 days, 14 days, you send another one. And if you don't hear back after that, then at least you've got an audit trail to say that you tried to get a reference. And if, yes, they provide you with a basic one, well, if that's all they're willing to provide to you, then you can only go on, you know, what you've got. Until the regime changes, you know, you can't force people to provide you with references, particularly, you know, if they're outside the finance sector at the moment. In terms of Anne, she's asked a question, what period would you recommend regarding ongoing checks on relevant employees? I think, again, Anne, that is probably going to be risk-based, looking at the person's role, responsibilities, and things like that. Certainly, if you are a COLP, the MLRO, the MLCO, then I'd be wanting to do at least 6 monthly. For other people, annually. But again, it really depends on you. And again, what you have to consider, of course, is in the context of the money laundering regulations, you've got to put these things in your practice-wide risk assessment. And there is a specific section relating to screening. So what is your policy? Why are you sort of giving additional screening to accounts people as opposed to secretaries or whatever? So all that needs to be in there. Okay, so I think I've just answered the question there for Laura Lee as well.
Yeah.
Let's have a look. I think just move down the screen a bit. Any chance we can get the slides? Yes, that's all coming. Yeah, slides are coming, Salman. So that's the end of the sort of the formal questions. As I say, we'll get the slides out to you and the recording, and we'll be in touch in one way, shape, or form. We have got a survey coming out straight afterwards, so if you want us to contact you to talk about the screening product or anything else, then of course just put it on there, and we'll be in touch. So on that basis, I'm going to draw matters to a conclusion. Thank you very much indeed, James, for everything that you've contributed today. Been really, really useful.
Thanks,
and
Brian.
thank you to everybody who has attended. Hopefully you've found it useful. We are running quite a few webinars at the moment, so do keep your eyes open for those. And of course, tomorrow, Thursday, I've got my monthly update webinar as well. So we've got quite a few bits and pieces to discuss there. So hopefully you can join me there. If you haven't registered for that and you want details, then please do give us a shout, and we'll be very pleased to give you the details on that one. So thanks very much indeed. Please do take care, and as always, please stay safe. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye all.